Why is the Justice Department considering filing an antitrust lawsuit against Amazon? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you all the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
It's good to see you and to be with our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, you want to give us an update on how your classes are going there at the Citadel?
Going very well. Molding the moldy minds as best I can. No, actually, I've just started grading some of the first exams of the semester, and they're doing very well.
And what are you teaching this semester?
I'm teaching intermediate macroeconomics and principles of microeconomics.
So, viewers, you get a sense of what life is like as a professor. He just teaches 2 classes, and he gets paid to do that. He's able to relax the whole rest of the week.
Dream on, dream on, dream on.
All right, Richard, let's talk about antitrust and monopoly laws. The reason I bring that up is because the Justice Department, according to an article in the Wall Street Journal, is planning what the journal calls potential lawsuits, or a potential lawsuit against Amazon, which is quite possibly the most successful company in our lifetime. Right. I mean, I remember when Amazon first got started, they started with just selling books. And it was so amazing from the very start as to the kind of service they were providing, because you could order a book and it would be delivered to you within like 3 days or something. I mean, it was absolutely incredible. There was other bookstores that you could go buy books at, like Borders and Barnes and Noble, and the place to buy libertarian books, of course, was Laissez-Faire books. I mean, Laissez-Faire was the place to go for libertarian books. But after a while, it was clear that nobody could compete against the service that Amazon was providing, including Laissez-Faire books. They ultimately were, I think, unable to survive because of Amazon. And Amazon put Borders out of business. And it's an incredible company. And then they started expanding to other things. So now today they sell just about everything. I can't think of one thing that they don't sell there, including used books. That you and I, back in the day, we would have to go to used bookstores to find books that we were looking for about Austrian economics or history or whatever. Now you can just go on Amazon and find used books there too. So it's been an incredible, successful company. I think it's one of the economic marvels of our time. And so, not surprisingly, people on the left, the economic interventionists, say, oh, well, it must be a monopoly because it's so big. Same kind of ludicrous thinking that has pervaded leftist economic thought, gosh, since 1890, when the Sherman Antitrust Act was passed. And as you know, Richard, we libertarians have long held that there's nothing wrong with success. That a company that gets big and large, yes, they might do it through government largesse, like some of these so-called defense contractors, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about success in the marketplace. And success in the marketplace means that you have satisfied consumers in a big way. And the measure of that is how much revenue you're getting, because what you're really doing is selling a product or a service that other people are willing to pay for. So the more successful you are in the marketplace, that's a sign that you have been most successful in satisfying the wants and needs and desires and demands of consumers. So bigness is a sign of success, that you've done a good job, but not for these economic interventionists. They say, oh, well, this bigness, now you're a monopoly. You've reached a point where people can't really compete against you effectively, and so we have to take action against you. And that's what's going on here. It's not clear what they're targeting Amazon for. But they've got an array of possible things like bundling and improper trade positions and how they position themselves in the marketplace. This is all nonsense, Richard. I mean, Amazon is a private company. It has the right to run its operation any way it wants. If it wants to buy another company that's competing against it, it's got that right. And everybody else has the same right to do what Amazon does, sell their products online, establish alternative markets. All that they're going to do is interfere with one of the most successful companies in the world. But this is not a surprise. This is what they've done throughout the history of antitrust, stretching all the way back to 1890. What do you think?
Well, I think that we have to understand that the particular worldview, as you're suggesting, that these people are looking at is they, as the regulators, the interveners, the social engineers, know better what kind of companies should be serving the consuming public, what type of operations they should be utilizing in bringing their products to the market. Separate from force or fraud, they have this idea of how sellers should interact with each other in a way that they view as desirable. And it's a total misunderstanding of how the market works. You touched upon a number of these things. Let me pick up on a few of them. First of all, bigness in a free market is won by success in satisfying consumer demand. No one earns a dollar in the marketplace unless they're able to offer a product that is better or less expensive or new and improved compared to their rivals. And if they accumulate a large number of dollars, the result of this is due to the fact that more and more consumers have chosen their variation on that product theme compared to available substitutes or rivals. So bigness is itself an indication of consumer satisfaction and not consumer exploitation or consumer disregard. The other thing that needs to be focused on here, it seems to me, is the perspective in which this is being looked at. And you suggested this too, I guess. And that is, theirs is a snapshot view of the economy. That is, imagine that you take a snapshot and it's a frozen frame. The analogy I use with my students, imagine that you take a picture of a man who has just stepped off the edge of a cliff and he's hanging in midair in this frozen frame of this photograph. Would you consider this a stable or unstable situation? Well, most people would consider hanging in midair off the edge of a cliff would be considered highly unstable and undesirable. But I tell them, it depends upon what came before and what comes after. I said, this could be the frozen frame of one variation of two in a motion picture. In one variation, the cowboy is being chased by the Indians and they've cornered him at the edge of a cliff and they've thrown him off and he's about to die as his body hits the rocks far below. Well, being hanging off the edge of a cliff would be considered highly undesirable in that scenario. But what if it's a different storyline? The Indians are chasing the cowboy to the edge of the cliff. He realizes they're going to kill him. He looks far down below and there's a river there. He knows if he stays where he is, they're going to capture him and kill him. But if he jumps into the water, there's a chance that the water is deep enough to break his fall and the current will take him downstream to safety from those who are chasing him. Then him hanging in midair is the way to escape likely death. So which is better? The idea is you can't look at it as a frozen frame. You have to look at it as a motion picture, the sequence of events before, the one you're looking at, and what is likely or possible to follow with. The market is a dynamic process. This has been emphasized by Austrian economists like Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, Israel Kirzner, or those who came out of that Austrian tradition, even though they didn't view themselves as Austrian economists, particularly Joseph Schumpeter. Schumpeter argued in his Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy that the market economy needs to be viewed as a process of creative destruction. And the test is not whether some company looks big or not right today, but you have to judge the competitive force and the actions of competitors in the market, not over a day or a week or a month, but sometimes years, even decades. In the late 19th century, early 20th century, there was always this fears of the railroads. Oh, they have a monopoly over transportation and cargo carrying. Oh, they need to be regulated. That was one of the bases for the first Interstate Commerce Commission regulatory agency in 1877, or at least part of the rationale. But fast forward, looking over years and decades, who even thinks of the railways as a monopoly anymore? The fact is that what transformed the market? The automobile, trucking, cargo carrying, so that in fact, yes, railways are still a major way of hauling cargo and shipping, but trucks and other road cargo vehicles are equal to, or if not more important, to the flexibility and the dynamism to get to where you want to go in the least amount of time and getting produce and products and goods and services to people. You could say that there was a monopoly on horse ranchers, because who could get around if you didn't have a horse to either ride or pull a wagon? Well, the automobile replaced that. So and then the automobile and the railroad was superseded by the convenience and availability and the safety of airplanes. So if you take a long enough stretch, all this disappears as long as the market is open and competitive. Let's take Apple, for example. When Apple came out in it's 13, 14 years, I guess, around 2007, 2006, when they came out with the first version of iPhone, okay, the smartphone. They had a monopoly on this. That is, they were the single seller of this particular version of a communication device, a handheld communication device. And they must have had close to, for this, 100% of the market share. Fast forward today with Galaxies and Google versions and all the others. Does Apple still have a large market share? But it's not the single market shareholder in the United States or certainly globally. Another example would be is when Apple came out with the first iPad, the tablet. It had, like, when it first entered the market, there was very few rivals at that time. It had like 90%, 97% of the market. I looked up that number, 97% of the market when it came out with the iPad. I just looked before we went on today, I double checked it. Today, Apple has less than 50% of the tablet market. And in 2021, that's the 2022 figure. In 2021, they only had 37% of the market share of all tablets. So the fact is that these change, they fluctuate in terms of the successes, the failures, the new versions, the improved versions, so that the market is a dynamic factor that should be looked upon as the market, that is the consumers making these judgments, and not being the second guessing of politicians and bureaucrats. All of these famous cases upon which the antitrust laws were based, the Clayton Antitrust Act and so on, the Sherman Act, these have all been put under the microscope of careful criticism. And if I can just mention the most important book for any viewers who wants to know a little bit about the history of the antitrust laws from this more dynamic market competition perspective, that book is by Dominic Armentano, now a retired professor of economics, called Monopoly and Competition, Monopoly and Competition. It came out originally back in the 1990s or late 1980s. He went through a couple of editions revising it, but he goes through all the famous cases of the late 19th and well into the 20th century and shows that all of the evidence that was presented was either faulty or misinterpreted, and certainly in terms of a sound understanding of how markets work, misunderstood. And that not only were there no monopolies, or the monopolies were an illusion, or in fact, the person who had the largest market share had only gotten the market share because of making that better mousetrap and offering it at a better price. One other point here, and that is, well, what does monopoly mean? Okay, what does monopoly mean? Well, it comes from the ancient Greek, mono, meaning one, and poly, meaning seller, so one seller. The question that has to be asked is that why is there one seller in a market? If someone comes out with a new product, never before placed before the consumers, well, certainly he's a monopolist. Of course, he's the single seller of a new product. Let's suppose that this product is desirable and successful. His very success will bring forth other competitors to say, look, he's making a fortune on this new product. How can I make a better one, a innovative version of his, a lower cost one so I can sell it for a less version of his. And so over time, he's very successful, attract the rivals and competitors to undermine his single seller position. On the other hand, let's suppose that some seller comes out with a product that turns out to be a dud. Given the expenses of bringing it to market, the consumer demand is not sufficient to cover the cost of manufacturing and not likely over any imaginable period of time. Would we want more sellers to come to market and waste more resources on something which consumers don't want enough to cover the cost of manufacturing? The resources should be used for other things. Investment decisions should be in a different direction. We wouldn't want that. So as long as we think of it in this way, we realize that the market itself does not create these exploitive single seller positions. What does? Well, if you look historically at the most egregious instances in which there's been one or a very small handful of competitors that seem to be taking advantage of their market positions, they are invariably those sectors of the economy or those particular producers in a market who have had the helping hand from government, restricting competition, limiting competition, giving licensing permission to be the only producer or the only seller of a good within a geographical area. That's the basis of concerns about monopoly. You want an anti-monopoly policy? Then follow the widest latitude of both domestic and international competition. And that will assure that no one gets to be taken advantage as long as government stays out of the way.
Yeah, that last point I think is critically important as to what really makes a genuine monopoly. Because the interventionists say, oh, well, it's bigness that makes a monopoly. And as you're pointing out, well, bigness may be just because that company happened to be first in producing a particular product that everybody wants to buy. But that's ridiculous. That's like I was saying earlier, that's a measure of success. So what is a real monopoly? A real monopoly is one where the government steps in and enacts a law that says everybody is prohibited from competing against this privileged company. Now, that privileged company may be a private company or it may be a government enterprise. Doesn't matter. That if somebody tries to enter the market and with a different kind of product, like you're talking about, an innovative type of variation on the product, the monopolist will go to court immediately and get an injunction shutting down that competitor. And what he does is he cites the law that gives him this special privilege. And this is why, in fact, the American people and the British people were so opposed to monopolies, because they had been so abusive that when you're in a monopolist, a genuine monopolist where the government's protecting your privileged position, you tend to start treating customers shabbily. You don't have to worry about how you treat customers. They have nowhere else to go. And the classic example of this phenomenon is the Postal Service. I mean, it's amazing to me that all these economic interventionists can complain about big companies, but remain strangely silent on the Postal Service, because this is your classic example of a monopoly. It's a gigantic economic enterprise. If anybody tries to compete in the delivery of first-class mail, the Postal Service will immediately go to the Justice Department. The Justice Department will immediately file an application for a temporary restraining order and injunction in federal court, and they will shut that competitor down immediately. And they will haul him up into court to show cause why he shouldn't be shut down permanently. And they do shut him down permanently. That's what a real monopolist is. And of course, we all know what the results of the Postal Service are. I mean, these are the way you get treated by the Postal Service is not exactly how you get treated by a private company. And you inevitably have long lines there, especially at Christmas time. And I mean, it's ridiculous, because the private sector could clearly provide first-class mail delivery much more efficiently and much more customer satisfying than the Postal Service does. But this has been the whole history. If you go back all the way to 1890, you had the Rockefellers that had their oil refineries. They said, "Oh, we'll see. They're so big. This I forget the name of the oil company that Rockefeller had. Standard Oil. Standard Oil is so big and so powerful." Well, Standard Oil was buying up a lot of smaller companies to become bigger, but all that was doing was encouraging more private companies to open up. and they were essentially screaming, buy me, because Rockefeller was paying top dollar in order to try to, expand its reach. And another point here, Richard, is that you don't need the government to break up these companies, because the free market does a very effective job of that. As you pointed out, market share of these large companies that were considered monopolists back in the day when they were getting going has been dropping. Now, if they were true monopolies, which the government claims they were at the time, that they were huge and big and maybe the only seller, they should have maintained that position. That there shouldn't have been any competition. I mean, like at the Postal Service, you don't see any competition there. So how come these other big companies lose market share? Well, it's because the market's relentless. I mean, as Ludwig von Mises pointed out, consumers are a fickle bunch. They don't stick with you if you're not providing them total satisfaction. If they find somebody else that provides a better product at a lower price, they're out of there. There's no loyalty in the free market, or very little loyalty. People want the best product for the lowest price, and that's why they start losing market share. If you go back to the Fortune 500 list of top, let's say, 30 companies in 1970, I will guarantee you that at least 90% of those companies are no longer in the top 30. But at the time, they were called monopolists. They were big, they were successful. Well, it wasn't because the government broke them up. It was because the free market, as long as it provides open opportunities for people to come in and compete with a better mousetrap, inevitably those big companies, if they don't continue satisfying the consumer, they're going to lose market share, and they're going to go off that list of the top 30. And that's what's happened. So the free market's a great redistributor of wealth, because consumers are a very fickle bunch. They're going to go with who they think is providing the best mousetrap at the lowest price.
Two examples in, let's say, the last 50 years is definitely telecommunications and the airline industry. Both of these are highly regulated sectors of the economy. The airline industry, no one could fly passenger planes that had not been licensed by the Civil Aeronautics Board, which had come into existence in the 1930s and resulted through the regulatory apparatus at that time in reducing the number of passenger airline carriers. Basically, you had a half a dozen major carriers. American Airlines, Delta, Northwest Airlines, and Pan Am, and a few others. But then in the late 70s and early 80s, the CAB was basically abolished. And they opened the airline industry to basically wide competition. If you were making planes and they had their safety regulations met, you could be flying planes. And suddenly what you saw was this burst of both national and regional airline companies that came onto the scene within a handful of years. The cost of flying dramatically decreased. The variety of services that the planes offered expanded greatly. And suddenly airline travel became much more convenient in terms of selecting a carrier, the fees you had to pay for a flight, and then the conveniences of the locations that they flew to, both regionally and nationally. Another example of this, the regulation of the airwaves. The government has controlled through the Federal Communications Commission, the issuing of ability to communicate for decades and decades and decades. The only legal carrier of telephone services was AT&T, and AT&T. You had to do them locally. You had to do them through national calls, long distance calls, and you had to buy AT&T telephone equipment. And they would say, there's no way to improve this communication equipment. This is the best. This is about as far as we can go. And that was a stand on the desk phone with the receiver with the curly cord, and you had to turn the rotary dial. And then, by golly, AT&T admitted that progress was possible, and the rotary dial became a button. My golly, look at this, Mildred. They've gone about as far as they can go, from the rotary to the button. And the ingenuity of the human race never ceases to amaze me. But that was it. And then when these regulations were reduced, and suddenly this explosion of means of communication, the cordless telephone. The first cordless phone was in your hand and it had the antenna, and you can only still go so far from the base. But now the market was creative, Bumper. Jacob, what did they have? Oh, there's the Garfield phone. There's the Mickey Mouse phone. You listen in Mickey's mouth and you talk into his belly button. And then, of course, I know it sounds sexist today, there's the slender princess phone for the delicate and smaller female hand. Oh, the amazing of the market ingenuity. And then you just have those flip old-fashioned cell phones that you could get. And then, they've gone about as far as they can go, Jacob. It's not only a phone, but you can do basic arithmetic. I can add and subtract. Well, then you have this. And the varieties and the diversities of this. That's all by ending regulation, ending privileged market positions for AT&T, for a handful of airline companies. That has exploded amazingly and has made more products, better products, less expensive products available in two major areas of daily life: transportation and communication. This has also made first-class mail redundant. How many of us really want to wait to write a letter, put it in an envelope for it to be delivered, and then someone to write back to us to hear a reply? No, text messaging, emails, right? Now you have visual forms of Skype or Zoom. This has made first-class mail irrelevant and has been a way to get around the monopoly that the U.S. Postal Service has.
Well, one of the things that you didn't mention about the Princess phone is that you could walk around with that long cord and would not have to carry around the whole phone. You just carry around the part you hear and talk to. But Richard, I mean, there have been some innovations, the kind that you're talking about in the Postal Service. I mean, they have forever stamps now. And I mean, what a great innovation. And you see, nobody stops to think about the fact that nothing fundamental has changed in first-class mail delivery in decades. It's still the same thing. The mailman takes the mail to your house. You have to put a stamp on it. Basic same principle. And of course, everybody asks, well, how could there be an innovation over that? Well, they used to ask the same thing about phones and so forth. But that's the spontaneity of the market. I know we only have a few minutes left, but I thought I'd mention a legal case that involved monopolies. It really makes fascinating reading. It's the slaughterhouse cases that were in the late 1800s. It was a series of Supreme Court cases, and it involved monopolies. And interestingly, one of the lawyers representing the people that were trying to compete, a series of slaughterhouses in New Orleans that had gotten shut down by this monopoly law that gave the slaughterhouse privileges to one monopoly. The lawyer for that group was a former member of the U.S. Supreme Court who had resigned out of loyalty to the state of Louisiana. And then, of course, they had lost, and he was starting his law practice all over again. And he was representing this group of people. But I highly recommend people to look up online the slaughterhouse cases, and specifically not the majority opinions, because they ended up upholding this monopoly under the 14th Amendment, but particularly the dissenting opinions, like Stephen J. Field, who himself was a remarkable character in the history of legal jurisprudence. But here is where the real origins in the Supreme Court came about on the principles of economic liberty. And so you learn not only a lot about the history of monopolies and why there was so much revulsion against monopolies, both here and in Great Britain among the populace, but also how the concept of economic liberty got established. So just Google that, slaughterhouse cases and dissenting opinions, and I think you'll really enjoy it. All right, Richard. On that note, we're about out of time. We'll wrap things up. Thank you all for tuning in, and come and visit us at fff.org. Of course, our YouTube channel where we post this particular show, and we post all our articles on Twitter. And Richard, as always, I greatly enjoyed this conversation, and look forward to seeing you next week.
Until next time.